Welcome back, America. One of my favorite people. I love doing this show because I get to see my favorite people, like Douglas Murray. Douglas Murray, Manhattan Institute Senior Fellow. Great book on democracies and death cults, Israel and the Future of Civilization. You know, Douglas, the President of the United States the other day gave an unbelievable speech at the UN. He laid into Putin and Russia. He defended Ukraine and Zelensky. He laid into the Islamists and the weak European leaders, almost all on the left, who are selling out Israel and embracing the terrorists. He laid into the immigration issue about how it's destroying Europe and it will destroy our country. He laid into them over freedom of speech. I couldn't have been more proud. I've got to believe that some of the cabal of isolationists, Putin lovers, Israel haters on the right and certainly on the left, they must have been furious about our great president, Donald Trump, don't you think?
Absolutely. I mean, it was an incredible speech, and not least because of the fact that the president did away with all of those idiotic diplomatic niceties that are pretty much the norm, the expected norm, whenever a world leader stands on the stage of the United Nations. You know, all of our lifetimes, you know, we've seen presidents and prime ministers, they get up there and they say all of the bromides and agreed talking points to pay tribute to the various shibboleths of the time. And President Trump just did away with all of that and told the United Nations a whole pile of uncomfortable truths. And the interesting thing is, as you point out, Mark, is that cuts across quite a lot of lines. He was very tough on Putin. He was tough on the enemies of Israel. And he was tough on the Western governments that have allowed unalloyed open borders migration, legal and illegal, to completely change the nature of their countries. And the interesting thing is that, you know, quite a lot of people on left and right will agree with one bit of that or maybe two bits of it. But he just told the truth about a whole set of issues, and it's very interesting watching the people who might get 20% of it, but not 100%, fuming that he was right on one of their issues instead of the fact that he was right on all of them.
You know, it's interesting to me, Douglas Murray, is people try to define MAGA. Who didn't create MAGA? Most of them have ridden the coattails of the president. Some of them are in the administration. Some of them are outside the administration. The left-wing media likes to promote the worst of them, the most absurd of them, the most bigoted among them, who really have nothing to do with the president and MAGA. They're more hangers-on and so forth. The most morally clear, pro-American person in this administration is the President of the United States. He can be relied on to make the right decision, even though maybe perhaps some others cannot, yes. No?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's, you know, he's had an incredible set of successes because he's willing to pursue what he sees as being in this nation's interest, in America's interest, in spite of all of the people who try to derail him. I mean, I can't think of a president who's had more attempts to derail his policies than Donald Trump has. But he's kept pursuing them nevertheless. And just compare that to some of his international counterparts. Look at people like President Macron in France or Prime Minister Starmer in England. You know, October the 7th, October the 8th, 2023, they said, we are with Israel in the face of the death cults of Hamas. And in less than 2 years, they've forgotten to demand an end to the war by demanding that Hamas put down its arms and release the remaining hostages, and instead, in under 2 years, have given Hamas what they wanted and announced a unilateral declaration of Palestinian statehood, something about which they have absolutely nothing to contribute and can't do anything about. But they've decided in under 2 years to completely shift their focus, and Donald Trump has not. He has remained consistent to his demand that the end of the war comes with the release of the hostages and Hamas giving up their weapons. And it's an amazing thing. You know, the world continues to turn and shift, but there is an enormous reward to a political leader like Donald Trump who does not shift and who knows where he is headed and where his aims and his policies and his administration should go.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.